Okay, so maptangjan ago, gawisay ago, naimbag nga aldaw, magandang umaga, hapon, gabi and good good day po sa ating lahat. So from wherever we're streaming or joining the Zoom at, so welcome again to panel 10 of the third International Cordillera Studies Conference. So we are in panel 10, the title of which is Indigenous People Sustainable Self-Determined Development, IPSSDD, and the Sustainable Development Goals. For this session, we will be having 4 presenters. I think they're still coming in, but we have one that's already in the Zoom meeting. So the panel presenters will be Ms. Victoria Tauli Corpus, who will be sharing about Indigenous people's rights to self-determined development. Then we will have Ms. Grace Balawag for Indigenous Peoples Partnerships for Sustainable Development. Then we have Ms. Bernice C. for Monitoring Indigenous People's Rights and Sustainable Development Goals. And then we'll be having Mr. Roger Lambino for Community Strengthening of Indigenous People's Resource Inventory, the case of Guinaang, Pasil, Kalinga. So before we proceed to our presenters, let's just have a few reminders for how we will conduct ourselves for the Zoom meeting. So first and foremost, if we are not speaking, let's mute our mic so that we don't distract others. If you have burning questions, we can type them in the chat and then we will collate them together at the end for the Q&A, or we can raise our hand at the Q&A portion at the end of all the panel presentations, and then we will call you, and that's when you can unmute your mic. If we're having connection problems, we can turn off our video so that it would lessen the bandwidth. What else? Okay, so I'm sorry, I forgot to also introduce Miss Paula Riva, who is here as our assistant moderator. And if there are technical difficulties, please chat with her in the Zoom. So this session is also live broadcasted from YouTube. So for all those who's also following this session from YouTube, thank you for being with us today. So, okay, so I think we could we could go right through the presentations already because we have a lot, so that we have more time for Q&A later. So, Miss Paula, can we play the first presentation?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Victoria Tauli Corpus. I am the Executive Director of Tubtuba, which is the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. I'm also the previous UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I occupied this position from 2014 to 2020. In this presentation, I would just like to talk about the Indigenous Peoples Sustainable Self-Determined Development Framework, which is a framework that we have developed together with our partners, other Indigenous peoples organizations from other parts of the world who come together under the name of ELATIA. This framework has been developed, has evolved because Indigenous peoples have been participating in many global processes, whether this is in the processes which are talking about Indigenous peoples' rights and human rights, the processes around climate change negotiations, the ones that are happening around the Biodiversity Convention, as well as areas where territorial management or land-based management are also being talked about, as well as the different processes related to women, like the Commission on the Status of Women, and Indigenous peoples processes within the United Nations, like the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the UN expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous rights of indigenous peoples, as well as the special procedures, in particular the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. So what is this framework? This framework attempts to bring together all the different pieces of development so that it will be implemented in a more holistic way instead of being caught up between different silos. This indigenous peoples' sustainable self-determined development framework is a framework that integrates the human rights-based approach to development, the ecosystems-based approach, or the land, the integrated land management approach, in which the area we are talking about is more about the various ecosystems where indigenous peoples find themselves in, and not just on political boundaries that have been artificially set up by the states. It also integrates the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, the intercultural ways of indigenous peoples, in which they look at the diverse cultures amongst themselves and between themselves and their neighbors, and take into account these different cultures. It is intergenerational, which means it looks at the past. It gives importance to what happened in the past. Of course, it works effectively on the present, and it works with the future in mind. That as the indigenous peoples are known to think 7 generations ahead, that the future generations have to be in our minds when we talk about development and when we implement development. And finally, this is development that also ensures that there are more sustainable economies, economic sufficiency. The thing being discussed in the UN at present are the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we know, the Sustainable Development Goals are goals that have to be achieved we have never imagined. Hunger as well is a problem that people face all over the world, especially poor people, which includes indigenous peoples. These goals also include the climate change target, a goal on climate change, as well as a goal on strengthening institutions, which indigenous peoples are looking at very seriously, because the whole issue of indigenous governance is at stake in this whole framework. And if in the researches that we have undertaken and others have undertaken, the evidence will show that where indigenous governance systems are vibrant and strong, this is where we also saw better well-being for indigenous peoples, higher rates of biodiversity, higher and richer biodiversity, as well as the traditional knowledge being used more substantially and being passed on to the next generations. The IPSSDD is being implemented by those that we are reaching, that we are working with, but for the indigenous governance systems are strong. For us to be able to monitor how to ensure that this is being implemented, we hold training activities. We have set up an ELATIA Training Institute, which is the training institute which ensures that the IPSSDD framework is being spread widely, that this is also being used to influence the policies and programs from the local government up to the global arena. Of course, our main partners in implementing this framework are the partners under the ELATIA partnership, which is a partnership with 18 indigenous peoples organizations and networks in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, basically in 13 countries all over the world. We have our partners are the ones that we are working with and relying upon to implement this framework. And regularly, there are capacity building activities that are done, and these are focusing on, of course, on children and the youth, but also ensuring that in all these trainings, 50% of the participants are indigenous women. No, we also do some research on what are the traditional livelihoods of indigenous peoples which are sustainable and which are still being practiced to ensure that these livelihoods are not being undermined or illegalized by states, or these are not being destroyed but by big powerful corporations. Examples of this are the for instance, cacao production by our partner Sildap in Mindanao, in which they produce cocoa that they sell, but at the same time, while producing this, they are also training the indigenous, their own people in terms of how to ensure ecosystem sustainabilities. In Ifugao, for instance, in Tinoc, we have the system of rice intensification, which is a technology that was developed collectively, and it's a way of producing rice by ensuring that you have better produce, better harvest, but at the same time, keeping your soil and your fields and the water in a sustainable way. We do a lot of advocacy work and linkages with government, at various levels, at the local level, up to the global level. At the local level, we have all these community strengthening processes where we ensure that indigenous peoples are becoming more aware about their rights. They are equipped with the skills to engage with government, and they get they jointly, sometimes with governments, they develop community development plans, which is the framework that they use to determine how they are going to work together as a community and how to ensure that their goals in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of well-being, and in terms of indigenous governance are still being done. That we hold dialogues with government officials. And here in the Philippines alone, we held dialogues even under this COVID situation. We had virtual dialogues where we were able to bring on board hundreds of government officials from the local up to the national level, and indigenous peoples are able to discuss directly with them their problems and get some responses to some of the problems that they have presented. And this has resulted to very significant success in terms of at least indigenous peoples getting their application for certificates of ancestral domain being dealt with in a better way. I mean, and also for them to be able to damage control what is happening in their communities, especially with the entry of some corporations, even without their free, prior, informed consent. We have developed a community-based monitoring information system, which is a system which will allow the community to monitor themselves how development is happening, how are their lands, territories, and resources are being respected or protected. What is the extent of the biodiversity erosion or strengthening in their communities. So they do resource inventories and of course participatory mapping, and they come up with three-dimensional maps that are displayed in the community so that the community will know have a more intimate knowledge of what their territory is all about. So these are just some of the few things that we are doing to ensure that the IPSSDD framework is being implemented. But of course, at the end of the day, what we are really looking at is how we will use this framework to strengthen the communities, to empower them to be more self-determining, and to empower them as well to influence policies, laws that will prevent discrimination against them, and that will ensure that their systems that have been proven to work since time immemorial are still being used, and they are recognized by the governments and other actors. We have also an Indigenous navigator process where it's similar to the community-based monitoring information system, but this is done globally, and so it's looking at how Indigenous peoples situations are improving and how their rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are being protected, respected, and fulfilled. So this is just to give you an overview of what IPSSDD is all about and how we are planning to pursue, how we are using this to pursue our objectives of strengthening Indigenous peoples, enabling them to assert and claim their rights, and also enabling them to further fulfill their obligations towards nature, towards their neighbors and themselves, and of course, ensuring that their identities and cultures as Indigenous peoples continue to exist and continue to bind them as a people and as guardians of the most important ecosystems in the world today. Thank you very much.
All right, so that was the first presentation, which is an overall or general overview of IPSSDD and how it is being realized by the of which Ma'am Vic is the director. Now we proceed to the second presentation, which will be by Ms. Grace Balawag on Indigenous Peoples and Partnerships. I'm sorry, Miss. Yes, that's the one. Thank you po, Ms. Paula.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us to join this event. I am Grace Balawag, working with Tibtiba under the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Program, and I am the Assistant Program Coordinator. I also help coordinate the partnerships that Tibtiba had been building and coordinating. In this presentation, I would like to discuss on the Indigenous Peoples Partnership towards Indigenous people's sustainable and self-determined development. So firstly, I would like to share with you the importance of building and sustaining meaningful and equitable IP partnerships towards IPSSDD. We have to do this in consideration of the current situation, challenges, and emerging threats that impact on the human rights, lands, territories, and resources, knowledge systems, and culture of the Indigenous peoples. In the process, based on mutual trust and respect, we were able to build partnerships to forge common agenda and corresponding strategies with relevant stakeholders. So this is among Indigenous peoples organizations and with other NGOs, civil society organizations, academia and universities, government units and agencies, state parties and delegations, as well as churches, faith groups, and UN bodies. We also build partnerships with other multilateral bodies and funding mechanisms. So in this presentation, I would like to share experience of best practices from long years of partnership and cooperation with, among, and by the indigenous peoples themselves. Okay, so based on Tubtuba's experience over the years, I would like to categorize our various modalities of partnerships, which include the following. Number one, Tubtuba coordinated and IP-led partnerships and networks at the global, regional, and national levels. Secondly, we also serve as organizing partners for the Indigenous Peoples Major Group on Sustainable Development Goals. Number three, Tubtuba is also a member of various networks such as Action Klima Philippines, which is a national network of CSOs, IPOs engaged in climate change. And we are also working with the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change as a global caucus of IPOs engaged with the UNFCCC process. And also the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity under the CBD, and among other networks. Fourth, Tubtuba is also building partnerships with other institutions and structures of the indigenous peoples at the local and community levels, which will be shared later by our colleagues. Having said that, I would like to go back to our partnerships at the global level, regional level, and national level. Here I'm presenting some maps of this partnership. So firstly, we have the ELATIA partnership. This is an indigenous peoples global partnership on climate change, forests, and sustainable development, which we called ELATIA, which is a Maasai word meaning neighborhood. We have a total of 19 partners within 14 countries across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Secondly, I would like to share on the Asia-Pacific Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility, which Tubtuba is also coordinating. We are now in the 5th cycle of this program, which started in 2018 and will be ending this 2022. We are working with 12 partners within 10 countries in Asia-Pacific. We started this partnership since 2011, which is the 3rd cycle, and then continued with the 4th cycle, and we are now in the 5th cycle of this partnership. Thirdly, on the regional level as well, we have the Asian Indigenous Women's Network. We have 19 partners within 9 countries in Asia. This was formed in 1993 with a vision of supporting, sustaining, and helping consolidate the various efforts of indigenous women in Asia. At the national level, we are also coordinating UPACAT. This is the Ugnayang Pambansa para sa Katutubong Kaalaman at Talino, or in English, it is the National Network of Indigenous Peoples Structures and Indigenous Peoples Organizations for the promotion of traditional knowledge and wisdom. We have 14 partners based in various regions of the Philippines. And it was formed to strengthen the protection, promotion, collective practice, innovations, and transmission of indigenous knowledge systems and practices to the next generation. I would also like to share on the significant gains that we have achieved from these strategic partnerships of indigenous peoples. First, we were able to to be involved in the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the establishment of indigenous peoples spaces within the UN, such as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have a slide here on the participation of indigenous peoples, such as ELATIA partners at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues this year, 2021, and other processes as the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. ELATIA partners were able to participate in the UN Permanent Forum this year, and we were able to organize a side event focused on achieving SDG 16, which is building community resilience and strong indigenous peoples institutions. ELATIA partners, including Kimaren and Nadja in this slide, were able to share their experiences and how they have achieved or how they will be contributing to achieve this SDG goal 16. In the next slide, we have also organized the AIWN, or the Indigenous Women, in their participation in one of the side events, and also other processes such as the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We have here two pictures of our partners in the AIWN, which also shared their experiences in how they were able to contribute in eradicating the prevalent discrimination against them. For the next slide, it's just a shot of the adoption of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN had agreed upon in 2015. These 17 goals are supposed to be achieved by 2030, and indigenous peoples are engaged in monitoring how they have been contributing on the achievement of these SDGs. Another experience is on the adoption of COP decisions and references on the respect and recognition of indigenous peoples' rights, knowledge systems within the climate change. And one indicator of this is the operationalization of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform under the UNFCCC. This picture shows the participation of indigenous peoples in the dialogues and in the processes, engagement with state parties on how they will be supporting the decisions under the Paris Agreement. Finally, we had also been participating in the adoption of indigenous peoples' policies and guidelines in different mechanisms. And one of these is under the Green Climate Fund, which is also under the UNFCCC. We would like to share here a link to the video on the Green Climate Fund Indigenous Peoples Policy. So here you can see the web link of this Indigenous policy for further reading that you can take on later. From the experience of these partnerships and networks of indigenous peoples, we have the following lessons learned. First, these indigenous peoples partnerships and networks would like to reiterate the call for support to meaningful and equitable partnerships for sustainable and self-determined development. Secondly, We would also like to reiterate that over generations, Indigenous peoples, women, and local communities are long-time holders and practitioners of proven, effective traditional knowledge systems with corresponding customary governance protocols. Outside experts engaging with communities are not necessarily the holders of the most effective knowledge or solutions and should no longer prescribe projects and outcomes, but should be determined by the people and communities themselves. 3. Indigenous peoples and community members should not be viewed as beneficiaries, but should primarily be considered as partners in sustainable development processes and structures. And as we always say, they should determine and own the development initiatives being undertaken by them in their own communities. In conclusion, these Indigenous peoples partnerships have supported the collective engagement and effective advocacy work for the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights, Indigenous knowledge systems, and strengthened the capacity of Indigenous peoples as they pursue their IPSSDD as a contribution to the achievement of the SDGs. As you can see in this slide, Vicky Tauli Corpus, our executive director, had emphasized that the stories that we heard today are only part of the bigger picture. The recognition of Indigenous systems and the capacity of Indigenous peoples to adapt with the different changes can hugely help in the achievement of the SDGs. Finally, as a last slide, I would like to reiterate again this point from Vicky, wherein she mentioned that Indigenous people's lives will be in a much better state if they are able to pursue the kind of development they want to see in the present and in the future. Thank you very much. Dakul ay iyaman.
All right, that was Ma'am Miss Grace from the Tubtubas Climate Change and Adaptation Mitigation Program. So now we are halfway through our presentations. First, we had two on the general overview as well as the international partnerships and advocacy of Indigenous peoples in relation to self-determined development and sustainable development at the national and international level. And now we'll be listening to presentations from experiences at the ground level or at the community level themselves. So now we turn to the presentation of Ms. Bernice C. on the Indigenous Navigator.
Good morning to everyone. I'm Bernice C., the Tubtubas staff for the Indigenous Navigator project here in the Philippines. Today, I'm going to share with you a monitoring framework and tool to monitor Indigenous people's enjoyment of their human rights and development, including the Sustainable Development Goals. The outline of my presentation will start with a brief introduction of the Indigenous Navigator, then the process we went through in using this in the country, and then how we see our work going forward. If we are to ensure that Indigenous peoples are not going to be left behind in the implementation of the SDGs, there must be a way in which we can measure this progress. The minimum standard by which we assess the enjoyment of Indigenous peoples' rights and development is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UNDRIP, which encapsulates all the elements of human rights as provided for in international human rights instruments. However, the UNDRIP has no monitoring mechanism to assess the progress towards achieving the ends of the declaration. So the Indigenous peoples, in partnership with global institutions, developed the Indigenous Navigator for this purpose. Aside from monitoring the core human rights conventions as they pertain to Indigenous peoples, the IN also monitors the essential aspects of the SDGs and the outcomes of the 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. both a framework and a set of tools and resources, Indigenous peoples can use the IAN tools to collect data, to calculate and illustrate the levels of recognition and realization of their rights on the ground. The specific tools developed by the Indigenous Navigator Initiative are the following: a tools database and comparative matrix, to comprehensive questionnaires, the Indigenous Navigator Index, and the Indicators Framework. The IN framework has classified these human rights and development concerns into 13 domains, which cover comprehensively the collective and individual rights of Indigenous peoples. I will focus on the two key tools we have used: the National Questionnaire, which assesses the legal and policy framework of the country vis-a-vis the provisions of the UNDRIP, and the other one is a Community Questionnaire, which assesses the implementation of the UNDRIP and the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act on the ground. Both these questionnaires have accompanying guides which explains how to answer the question. So how did we do the Indigenous Navigator in the Philippines? We went through a process starting with a national consultation and training of Tebtuba partners in August 2017. In the end, 6 organizations volunteered to pilot the community questionnaire and were later joined by 2 island groups. We then went to 7 communities for community-based inception meetings and training. 6 participants were identified by their organizations or indigenous political structures to be trained as facilitators and data gatherers. In these trainings, questions were studied one by one. Available facts and information were noted, sources of data were identified, questions for FGDs, community assemblies, and interviews were disaggregated. Key informants were identified. And during the training, the elders and leaders were there, and anybody interested to participate were welcome. Usually, it took 3 days for the training, which included planning for the community assembly, the FGDs, the individual interviews, and the follow-up to the secondary data collection. Just after the training, we started data gathering by convening community assemblies, organizing FGDs for women and youth, and in some cases, the indigenous political structures. Key informants were mostly the traditional leaders. Report back was done after the data was consolidated, organized, and the initial analysis done. Data gaps were identified for additional data gathering. After this, there will be planning to prioritize needs to be addressed and the identification of pilot projects. From the data collected, major issues were identified. First, land territories and resources. This relates to the difficulty of acquiring certificates of ancestral domain titles or the CAT, land grabbing, privatization and sacrilege of sacred sites, militarization, and the presence of businesses in ancestral domains without the free, prior, and informed consent of the concerned indigenous communities. Discrimination still persists despite the 1967 ratification by the Philippines of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Indigenous children are bullied in schools because of their indigenous descent. Indigenous women receive discriminatory remarks and services from health services. Indigenous peoples still experience discrimination in markets and other public places. Indigenous professionals report of discrimination in employment, deployment, promotion, and scholarships, and in terms of acquiring the legal document for the ownership of ancestral domains. The difficult process of acquiring CADTs vis-a-vis the easy process of acquiring Torrens titles is discrimination in itself. There is also the poor delivery of basic services and limited infrastructure in indigenous communities. For instance, 5 of the sites we went to cannot be reached by signals and 2 had intermittent signals. Then we have human rights violations. Historical injustices way back to colonial times and during the nation-building process in the country are still unresolved. Armed conflict with the ancestral domains in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, leading to violence including forced displacement of ancestral domain owners, among other consequences, is ongoing. There is the red tagging of indigenous people's human rights defenders who are defending and asserting their rights to their ancestral lands, domains, and resources, thus putting their lives at risk. Other issues include language. Indigenous languages range from being vibrant to being almost critically endangered. We also have very limited domestic water services. There is significant incidence of teenage marriages and pregnancies, and a lot of out-of-school youth, children and youth, some due to limited educational and life opportunities. Thus, we see a low incidence of professionals. We also being corrupted by traditional politics. One of the interesting issues thoroughly discussed in the communities is the concept of poverty. To the Iroman and Manuvu, poverty is a development situation that is shared and thus needs the community to help in meeting gaps. For the Lambangian, where there is no smoke, there is no food. What were the major challenges we faced during the implementation of this project? Time and resources. Time and resources are needed to empower communities to enhance their capacity to generate and analyze data related to their situation, address the human rights and development challenges, and participate meaningfully and substantively in decision-making at all levels, both in their communities and outside. In relation to the tool, we translated the long version of the community questionnaire into Filipino and Bisaya. We provided facilitators notes and guidance on where to get data. We formulated alternative questions and rephrased some. And we also grouped related questions to facilitate conversation and note-taking. On the data, there is a massive lack of disaggregated data at all levels, especially at the municipal and higher levels. The collected data we have is not uniform, as some communities decided on what is relevant to collect, or there was lack of material time and resources, and the availability of secondary data, among other factors. There is the challenge of how to continue the process to complete, clarify, revise, validate, and update data. Access to government data is more difficult at lower levels, either because these are not present or it's not accessible. Although there are trained Indigenous individuals skilled in human rights and development work, they are so few in the face of the enormous needs for monitoring the human rights and development situation of their communities, thus the need to train more on documentation and human rights analysis. Indigenous leaders and IPHRDs are overwhelmed with the need to influence law, policy, and implementing agencies, and their numbers are limited. So the need for more people to be equipped with advocacy skills, so with negotiation skills. In this new normal, it became apparent that Indigenous peoples must be equipped to engage in the different social media and online platforms if they have to effectively do their work. In the face of these challenges, what had been the contributions of the IN to the partners and the communities? The IN provided the opportunity for the partners to visit, meet, and consult with their constituents, engage the authorities and other stakeholders, implement pilot projects, and enhance their capacities for the work they do. Overall, we see strengthened strategic alliances and engagement of partners with the state and other stakeholders through the process and the work of the IN. One partner used the process and data they gathered to enhance the content and substantiate their ancestral domain sustainable development protection plan, and the other used these two for their community strategic development plan. It also provided an opportunity for increased ground support for lobbying through data gathering and awareness raising during the period of the drafting and ratification of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. As we also train our partners on finance management, we see an increased capacity for our partners to access funds that require standard financial management procedures. Between November last year and January this year, our partners met with representatives of various line agencies at the national level in a virtual dialogue series to directly share their concerns and get commitments for action. With training in some data in their hands, leaders have increased capacity to do evidence-based advocacy and planning. To bring their concerns to the international level, partners prepared and submitted a voluntary national review report to the 2019 UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. As a result of the identification of needs based on the analysis of their situation, partners identified their pilot projects. At the moment, the IN is supporting two social enterprise projects on the trading of non-timber forest products and agricultural products. Another one is a post-harvest facility for the milling of rice and corn. Materials are being developed and produced for Indigenous people's education through the enhancement of existing orthography for the Mandaya and the Iromanan, which were developed by their own professionals. For the Mandaya, there is a close collaboration with the Division of the Department of Education in Davao Oriental. For the Iromanan, through social mapping, the histories of the 13 Bansa are also being produced. We also published the Philippines fact sheet on Indigenous peoples based on the assessment from the national questionnaire. So how do we see the future with our partners in this Indigenous Navigator initiative? Support for continuous documentation, monitoring of and reporting on the human rights and development situation of Indigenous communities, not only by themselves, but also by advocates and the human rights institutions to bring about just and lasting peace and sustainable development to the Indigenous communities. Support for community-initiated projects, including documentation, revival, propagation, and promotion of Indigenous knowledge systems and practices, as oral tradition is still prevalent. There needs to be dedicated support for the continuing capacity building of Indigenous women, children, and youth, especially girls, to increase their agency, their sense of self-worth, and thus participate more meaningfully and substantively in decision-making both in the traditional and informal institutions and processes. Support for the continuing strengthening of political participation of Indigenous peoples with training for Indigenous peoples legislators, executives, and others in authority for them to support their people's development priorities and struggles. This must be supported with continued advocacy for the legislation and implementation of laws, policies, programs, and projects in support of Indigenous people's rights and self-determined development. Finally, we must lobby for the adoption of frameworks and tools like the IN and the Community-Based Monitoring and Information System, or CBMIS, by government agencies. The IN and CBMIS data adds an important community-based dimension to the landscape. These are the calls to make Indigenous peoples to not be left behind in achieving the SDGs with the data in their hands. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. So we just heard from the experiences of Indigenous Navigator communities, partner communities in the Philippines. And now we will turn to the experience of a specific community here in the Cordilleras, the Guinaang of Pasil, Kalinga. So let's hear from Mr. Roger
Hello,
Lambino.
I am Roger Lambino, a staff of Indigenous Peoples Biodiversity Program of Tubtuba. In the preparation of this presentation, I am indebted to the Guinaang who have done the actual research process. We would also like to note that the Indigenous peoples of Guinaang use the term tribe to distinguish themselves from others and will be used to that effect in this presentation. My part this morning is to share experience of Tubtuba in partnership with the Indigenous Farmers Association of Guinaang Pasil on how community-based monitoring information system can be used to monitor implementation of the Indigenous People's Sustainable Self-Determined Development Framework, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to show how mapping and other tools for monitoring help in the Guinaang community in asserting the right to self-determination to their land, territories, and resources. Ifugao Participatory Action Research is an example of a community-based monitoring information system, CBMIS. Under CBMIS, Tubtuba and its partners clustered indigenous relevant indicators to 5 domains. Ifugao mapping and research touches all of these, but especially in relation to land, territories, and resources. The Guinaang tribe, as a subtribe of the Kalinga ethno-linguistic group, is one of the tribes within Pasil municipality in Kalinga province under the Cordillera Administrative Region in the Philippines. Guinaang tribe is composed of 6 villages of barangays Poblasyon, Barangays Galdang, Barangay Bagtayan, Barangay Pugong, Barangay Maluksad, and Barangay Dangtalan. While the area coverage of Guinaang tribe is 7,086 hectares, this is based on the Ifugao mapping conducted in 2016. Guinaang tribe's population of 3,438, which is 34% of the total population of Pasil. Guinaang tribe is strategically positioned on a flat mountain top where people can see those who enter their territory from all sides. The Guinaang villages are traditional producers of various indigenous rice varieties, coffee, legumes, sugarcane, basically for basi or sugarcane wine, and recently processed muscovado, raw sugar. Another traditionally and natural grown root crops and vegetables. They also produce clay pottery, brooms, basketry, and other handicrafts from non-timber forest products. But the practices has been gradually decreasing nowadays. The Guinaang strongly recognize the bugis or traditional boundaries of their ancestral domain, as well as the budong or pispak between those sharing bugis, although there have been changes due to the development in land use policies. From 2012 to 2014, Ifugao waged a successful campaign against the entry of a mining company from 2012 to 2014. To continue strengthening the defense of their community, the members of the Guinaang indigenous peoples reached out to Tubtuba for support. Thus, Tubtuba in Ifugao signed a memorandum of understanding of partnership and has pursued a collaborative partnership since 2015. Since its establishment, Ifugao built its partnership with non-government organizations and government agencies in advancing its mission to safeguard and upgrade the welfare of farmers and unite all members of the Guinaang tribe in the defense of their ancestral domain against these extractive industries. Next level after the initiation is part of the initiation process is the research. Ifugao initiate data generation except for the mapping activities where Tubtuba assisted by providing input on mapping and technical supervision during the actual mapping exercise. Some information and data are validated by staffs through actual observation, but most data are validated through workshops or group discussions. Data analysis and interpretation is done by group of core community after the staff has collated and did some organizing of data and information. Ifugao took the responsibility of facilitating and also the actual data generation themselves. Tubtuba provided the guidance on how to gather the core domains in the CBMIS work. Later, it realized that encoding is a challenge for Ifugao and that Tubtuba staff has to help. Nonetheless, Ifugao has tasked itself to still do this on its own. The community-based monitoring information system includes the mapping of their ancestral domain and inventory of resources within the various land use types as designated by the tribe and villages of the Guinaang tribe. Participatory community mapping exercise includes orientation, sketch mapping, the Google Earth database, topographic maps, 3-dimensional model map, the GPS, demarcation, and paper maps. The 3-dimensional modeling has been very exciting endeavor which catches the interest of the community. And actual GPS, the actual geographic positioning system demarcation is the most difficult part because the survey team needs to climb steep mountain ranges, experience sleepless nights, and walk on stormy weathers. And sometimes we lose our tracks. This is a cycle until it is completed. During the validations, everything is surfaced out from the experience as well as knowledge among elders which confirm all informations generated. It was so evident that during the mapping exercise, it shows that the Tinoc forest, mostly forests including agroforests, consists 75% of the Guinaang tribe domain. This illustrates that indigenous peoples knows best how to protect the forest through their local conservation efforts. Various results of the community-based monitoring information systems is the documentation of traditional knowledge on sustainable resource management. The wisdom behind customary practices were surfaced out. conservation measures and customary practice of sustainable resource use in the different land use or ecosystems were documented. Maps of the territory using Geographical Information System Google in the National Mapping and Resource Information Authority as base maps was done. Information on areas in hectares according to land use, peripheral boundaries, landmarks, forest lands. Guinaang were able to construct their three-dimensional map and have a visual for planning, monitoring, and assessment. Mapping the territory is a powerful tool to assert the rights and negotiate with concerned parties. This was maximized on the ongoing boundary settlements between Guinaang and Balatok, as well as other neighboring tribes. It is also used in the planning and decision-making in the community-based resource management on land use demarcation. And it's an important record of customary land territory, and is center base for easier access of among the members of the tribe. More on the CBMI's results is the assessment on status and trends on the knowledge and customary practices on resource management, provided in the venue for holders of traditional knowledge to articulate customary laws related to natural resource use, views on the changes happening in the relation to land use and changing lifestyle. Lastly, is the inventory of flora in the forest. This is to identify species of flora in the forest to be able to determine which are of extinction for regeneration. The Tubtuba Ifugao partnership also conducted institutional capacity building, which includes the following: Indigenous people's sustainable self-determined development trainings, leadership trainings, financial management training, social enterprise management. There is focus on the knowledge transmission to most of the community members. Reformation of tribal areas and boundaries through renewal of peace pacts with the use of the data in their mapping to make more public the affirmation of their customary tribal boundaries, which is being contested by the neighboring tribes. They became active in pushing for the holding of peace pact renewals with their neighbors, where results of their mapping were presented. Also, using the maps, Ifugao initiated an audience with the local government unit of Pasil municipality to clarify the tribal domain vis-a-vis the barangay system. The local government unit showed recognition and looks forward to the legal recognition. The process increased Ifugao confidence and strengthened their resolve to unite all the sectors of the tribe in all the 6 barangays, led by the farmers. In response to external threats of the proposed geothermal and mining projects to the customary tenure rights in ancestral domain of the Guinaang tribe, the Indigenous Association have accessed support from the Rights and Resource Initiative through its Strategic Response Mechanism Fund to facilitate the geothermal education campaign, forums, and NCIP linkages. Some of the results were they have arrived with a community resolution authorizing legal assistance. They have also prepared a resolution to appeal the false allegation to the people in Ifugao in particular. Livelihood interventions were innovations through rice land farming through system of rice intensification or SRI. Integration of sloping agricultural land technology to Sweden farming, revival of traditional seeds, especially legume production, carabao raising and pasture land development, enhancing agroforestry with support from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, mechanization of rice and sugar cane milling. Currently, there are no mechanisms for indigenous communities to directly engage at any level of sustainable development goals monitoring and reporting. Despite this, indigenous peoples, in this case the Guinaang, contribute to the achievement of sustainable development goals in the local level. Thus, all of these efforts should be accounted by the government. Major challenges and ways forwards were the following. The farming sector is still composed by a majority of the population. However, they are now limited to the older generations and the younger generations who are married and work as farmers within the village. The soil of the old rice fields needed replenishment after years of routinary traditional rice production systems in the use of some chemical inputs by a few farmers. More inputs of organic compost, natural biofertilizers, and indigenous micronutrients should be continued for much needed recovery of soil fertility. Those who tried the high-yielding varieties have experienced impacts on the fertility or productivity of the soil if the chemical inputs are not sustained. This is quite expensive. Some have not sustained this as an option for increased rice production. Irrigation canals need rehabilitation or may need to be changed, such as traditional irrigation canal systems in the use of pipes or to be concretized to enable sufficient irrigation water supply to reach the rice fields. Coffee production have also decreased, which is one of the supplementary source of income of the families aside from domestic consumption. There is also need for the rehabilitation or change of the old coffee trees to recover sufficient coffee production as an additional livelihood option. Farmers are experiencing shifts in seasonal weather patterns, spread of insect pests and diseases of plants in the rice fields in Sweden farms. There is a need to stimulate home and community gardens and local food production, to plant more trees and other produce, train farmers in other about nutrient-rich crops, develop medicinal plants, gardens, forms cooperative community groups to undertake agricultural activities. Tourism program becomes divisive and destructive if not properly participated and owned by the people. Because of rich potentials for resource extraction, corporations will not stop dealing with the people. Farmers need to build stronger mechanisms for unity building and solidarity. To be able to achieve strong people's resistance, we need to have continuing public education and awareness raising among the people. I would like to end by sharing these words of wisdom by the Guinaang elders. Adherence to our indigenous values, institutions, customary laws, and governance system have always guided the indigenous knowledge and practices. These knowledge systems and practices are part of the rich history, culture, and heritage of the Guinaang tribe. All these were inherited from our ancestors, and this is our identity which we should continue to practice and nurture so that we can pass on to the next generations. While there are changes of some of our indigenous values, culture, and practices, we still hold on to the basic foundations of our history and cultural identity that we hope to share and continue to instill to the next generations. Even with the influence of modernization, religion, educational systems, and other modern technologies, we hope to continue to hold on to our heritage and identity as Guinaang tribe. Thank you, Indakal Iyaman.
Okay, dakal nga iyaman nga talaga. So I know all the presenters will give really rich discussions on other topics, and I see that there are already some questions on the chat. So I think we can already start with our Q&A, and I believe all of the panel presenters are already in the Zoom call. So I think we can start. Okay, so I think I'll start with the one who's raising his hand, and then I'll get to the questions in the chat. So Mr. or MX Jersky, you want to ask your question on the floor?
Hello, good afternoon po. Ay, good morning pa lang, 1 minute pa lang before afternoon.
Yes, you're correct.
Okay, thank you po sa presentation ng lahat ng ating panelists. Actually, sinasite ko lang tong si Ma'am Vicky Tauli Corpus sa mga sa mga papers ko. Tapos ngayon, I am asking this question. Actually, this question po ay na-formulate ko dahil dun sa pag-attend ko ng ADS-TPP dito sa Nueva Ecija. Ang naging usapan namin ay nagkaroon ng paghamon para sa mga indigenous people na magkaroon ng pagkakakilanlan muli sa kanilang mga sarili. Subalit natapos ang aming ADS-DPP seminar, hamon pa rin ang nagiging problema. Isa po sa mga nakita namin na issue na makakaakibat natin sa sustainable development ay yung issue ng document ng kanilang sariling IKSP or Indigenous Knowledge and Systems and Practices. Ang nagiging problema lang po, I just want to ask this question on the view of our panelists. Kasi nagiging problema sa kontemporaryo nating mundo, ang kultura ay nabebenta, nababastos. Totoo po yun. At ito ay na-exploit ng hindi lang ng mga kapitalista, bagkus na maging mga academicians. Ang tanong ko lang po, kasi di ba meron tayong mga capacity building. Nakita din natin doon sa presentation nila ng lahat ng ating panelists na they include the capacity building on capacitating them on doing researches on themselves. The IPs doing researches on their own culture. I'm wondering kung ano po yung view ng ating panelists sa paggawa ng mga researches ng labas or outsiders, quote-unquote outsiders, specifically academicians, on the indigenous IKSPs of these indigenous people. We know that there is already a PIC or the pre-prior informed consent, pero ang question, ito ba talagang FPIC ay nai-implement? O alam naman natin na i-implement ito, subalit alam natin na mayroong manipulation of data, manipulation ng FPIC, na kaakibat dito yung the members mismo ng NCIP. So yun po, that's just my question lang. Ano yung view nila ng ating mga panelists doon sa paggawa ng researches ng outsiders? Kasi ang daming bioprospecting expedition na pinapalakpakan natin yung mga pag-inventory ng mga academicians and researchers. Pero nanggaling lang din naman yun doon sa mga IP. Ang nagturo kung saan nakalagay yung mga yun ay doon din sa IPs. So yun po yung aking POV, point of view. That's just my concern and question po. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jersky. So it's actually already before we go to our panelists so they can answer your question. I'll just give a time check. It's 12:03, so I know it's lunchtime for those in the Philippines, but I hope it's okay for us to extend a little bit, maybe 12:15, so that dahil I'm sure mayabong po ang magiging discussion po natin. So I hope that's okay with everybody. And I just like to note that the questions in the chat are noted, and I think the question from Mr. Caricativo, maybe we could save it for the end because I think it's a very big and deep question that maybe could encompass or that may be answered in some ways in the other specific questions. So I'll throw the question now to any of the panelists who'd like to answer. Ano po yung tingin natin sa mga outsiders or doing research on indigenous peoples and their knowledge?
I can respond, Abby, but I'm not, my video doesn't, they said the host doesn't like to put on my video, so I'll just pick up. First of all, first of all, I think that indeed, the problem of doing research has been recognized for a long time now, and indigenous peoples, I don't think indigenous peoples essentially are against the academics doing research in their communities. What they are asking for is that that they will be involved as well, no? Hindi lang yung extractive research where people go there, they ask them questions, and then after asking the questions and formulating whatever they did, they don't even bring back, the results of the research to them, to let them know what are their findings and to also ask their feedback if they agree with those kinds of findings. So I think that's the main problem na kumbaga a lot of researchers, they just look at indigenous peoples as sources of information but not really as partners in undertaking the research, no? So our advice always is that when you do research, can you please talk to the community, explain to them what is it that you are wanting to look for, get their agreement, of course, that whether this is something that they would agree to be done, and if not, then at least talk, have a dialogue
Kasi gano'n naman ang meaning ng inclusion di ba? Yung parang talagang kinakausap mo sila, sinasabi mo kung ano yung objective ng research mo, tapos at least magkukumit ka man lang ng process wherein you can get their feedback. And I think that's essentially what we are trying to stress with the academic communities. Of course, we know also about the incidents of doing research to do bioprospecting, and even the collection of genetic material from indigenous peoples. We know all about those issues, and so we also share this with the indigenous people, so that in the end it will be them who will decide whether they are willing to give their genetic materials, or even share the knowledge and the resources in terms of, say, traditional seeds, among others. I think that principle is all those principles are should be respected, and the rights to have control over the activities that are being done in their community has to be respected. We also believe that, but we believe that academics have a role, no? They can play a very good role and we have seen experiences where they really can be partners with the communities. I was in New Zealand. One thing that I was there one time, and I was attending a research meeting between the researchers and the ones who are doing their PhD dissertations and the community, And what they did is to ensure that they asked the community what is the topic, what is the subject matter that they think will be useful for them to be a subject of a dissertation. They involved the community, and when they presented the results of their dissertation, the community was involved. And in fact, in the panel which I saw, they were all talking together, and the community was saying about how the a PhD student involved them, and they have defined what is it that will be useful for them, and they are commenting on some of the findings and what needs to be done. So I think there are some good examples of this, and hopefully here in the Philippines we also will have examples like those. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Vicky, for that. So, Ms. Bernice.
I'd like to add to the response of Vicky. Actually, the academe can do a lot, because, for instance, certain scientific studies have to be done in indigenous communities. For instance, in terms of pollution, if in our fieldwork in the Agusan Marsh, the communities were suffering. Individuals in the communities were suffering from diseases which they think they got from being exposed to the waters of the polluted Agusan Marsh. And so the NGO there actually partnered with one of the academic institutions in Davao, and they came up with laboratory results. However, the problem there is, how will this become acceptable, for instance, to the government regulating agencies, so that they will act on such a report. Those are the challenges that our indigenous communities face. I know for a fact that in the vegetable producing communities here in the Cordillera, several academic institutions here had also been involved in determining, for instance, the levels of pesticide poisoning and those related matters. So the academe really has a lot of work to do. If they have to help the indigenous communities, then they have to engage them at the level where they are, on the priorities that they need to be researched on or to be documented. But what is important also is that the communities must be taught proper documentation and basic research skills. That's very, very important. And I think that's a big contribution that the academe can do if it has to be relevant in indigenous communities, and to return return the favor also of getting some information from them. In terms of the FPIC, that's a very controversial topic that we face when we go to the communities. And truly, there are several manipulations of the free, prior, and informed consent process, and we have the communities themselves, and us have been pointing this out to the NCIP. No, we have an ongoing discussion with NCIP, and this matter is being made. We are discussing these matters with them, so it is still a challenge.
All right. Thank you for those very detailed answers, and especially the experiences from communities themselves. So I want to ask if Mr. Roger or Ms. Grace would also like to add on to this question. If none, then I think we could raise the other question here in the chat. It's by, okay, so there's a question from, it's an email, sorry, CD Habito. And the question is, did NCIP play a role in all of these activities done by the paper presenters? So I don't know if maybe we could start with those that haven't spoken yet, either Mr. Roger or Ms. Grace.
Hi, Abby. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, but I think I'm having a problem with my video, so I apologize. May I off my video if I'm having unstable signal.
That's all right. No worries.
Yeah, okay. For Tubtuba, thank you for the question. Is it Mr. Habito? Actually, for Tubtuba, it's a protocol to reach out local government units, especially the national or the Commission on Indigenous Peoples, in every work that we do in the communities. For example, for the benefit of the presentation a while ago, for my presentation, we actually reached out in CIP before and during the process of our work in Kalinga, but we understood sometimes actually we don't deny, or we for the community that they have some gaps of engaging within CIP, so there is actually very limited engagement within CIP in the work in Kalinga. But for Tubtuba's work in other provinces in the Cordillera, actually NCIP is very active in working with working with the Tubtuba in the communities. It's a protocol that we do courtesy call with the NCIP. For example, during the conduct of the mapping in Kalinga, we reach out for NCIP province to assist, but unfortunately they told us that they don't have the resources, and actually the people should continue do it for themselves, so that as to program or as to plan as to their plans. And later, actually, the challenge here is how are we going to move forward with this with the efforts, initiatives of especially for the Indigenous Farmers Association of Guinaang to their legal recognition of their ancestral domain, and actually for their two what do we call that? Because we are telling a while ago regarding the documentation of indigenous knowledge system and practices. It is also significant that Ifugao has done a lot of this on the ground. So this is what we are looking forward for NCIP to work with them in the future. That's all. Thank you, Abby.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Roger. Ms. Grace?
Yeah, just to add to what my co-panelists had shared in relation to the participation of NCIP, we cannot deny the fact that there are some experiences wherein the FPIC process in behalf of corporations interested in the exploitation of the resources in the ancestral domains. There are direct experiences of indigenous peoples in the manipulation of the process. One experience is the NCIP field staff or the provincial level staff usually select their own elders and do not really talk to the actual elders who are in the communities. Actually, one of the guidelines for FPIC is to conduct the consultations within the communities itself, but in some cases they bring the selected elders in the outside of the community and bring them to the hotels in the town centers or provincial centers, and that's where they consult them. Whatever result of this, they will say that they have given their consent. So that is one direct experience that we have with FPIC, and as already mentioned by the one who had experience in, is it in Leviskaya? Yeah, there is really experience in manipulation of the FPIC. On the other hand, I would also like to reiterate that our community-based monitoring and information systems is a very participatory or community-based participatory action research. They do the research themselves, they map their lands and their land uses, they identify all of the domains or the domains in the researches, and put stress on what they really prioritize within the process. So as I already emphasized a while ago, indigenous peoples in the communities should be treated as partners in whatever process we do, from research to the implementation, to the planning, design, and implementation of initiatives. And by this, they will be the ones who will be doing the research themselves and doing their own development plans. Yeah, another question on what is it? I think that's it. Unless you add more.
I think. Okay. At this point, there are a lot of initiatives from indigenous people. So they are leading in so many international to local initiatives, like what has been shared, no? But the ELATIA network, and also on the ground, mainly communities, indigenous communities are now empowered, including their leaders, to engage actually the authorities. So for instance, we see here in Aroma, no? North Cotabato, the Arumano Manuvo Kamal, which is the indigenous political structure, is engaged actually with the Department of Agriculture, Department of Agrarian Reform in relation to a certain proclamation, no, in their ancestral domain, which they are trying to have a co-management arrangement with. So these are initiatives that are being done locally. The fact that we have the Indigenous Navigator and the community-based information management and information system, the IN and the CDMS, is an indicator that indigenous peoples are trying to seize actually the initiative to be able to assert their rights, monitor the rights, and also to define the self-determined development. So the future is very hopeful for indigenous peoples because they are also taking these initiatives. Thank you.
All right. Thank you po, Ms. Bernice. So before we proceed to Mr. Ruel's question, I think there's still one more question. Ms. Zenaida would like to ask a question on the floor.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you to our presenters. May I just give some insights regarding the FPIC? We also conducted several studies, particularly in indigenous communities, and we were able to coordinate with the NCIP, and they facilitated our our presentation of our proposals, in data gathering, and also in the validation of data. So I think NCIP can also be helpful in the conduct of the academic researches. And then for my question, I'd like to ask how the indigenous peoples themselves can be willing to, for example, do some restoration. Kasi based on our observation, malaking portion, particularly dito sa Benguet and even in some areas in the Cordillera, has been transformed into an agricultural farming. And we know that this is also important for their livelihood, but at the expense of the forests that are already being converted into agri-farming. So my question is this: is that how indigenous peoples are also willing to do some restoration of this land into an forest? And if particularly for Sir Lambino, I don't know if I have missed it, but how much of the land are being converted into agri-farm? And then in their agroforestry projects, are they promoting native trees in agroforestry? So those are my questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you po, Ms. Zenaida. So I don't know, maybe Mr. Roger, you'd like to answer the question first?
Thank you, Ma'am Zenaida. Thank you for the question. For Guinaang, actually, underdevelopment on agroforestry, yeah, they had integrate indigenous tree species and like fruit-bearing trees, especially. And yeah, that's the result. Actually, it's a result from the forest resource inventory that they have to regenerate indigenous tree species from the forest, because they had observed that some of it were already decreasing in number because of the activities on the small scale mining within the forest. And actually, for the land area question, conversion, for the Guinaang tribe, there is no significant area on land conversion. Thank you. Abby, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Roger. So do anyone, maybe if one more presenter would like to answer or would like to add? But if none, I think we can proceed to the final question. And I would like to request if Ma'am Vicky would like to explain her answer, which she also placed in the chat. So I will do a shortcut of the last question, and then I hope everybody we still stay on board so we can have photo ops. So sorry, we are past what we agreed on earlier, which is 12:15, but I hope we are learning much from the discussion we're having right now. So the final question from Mr. Roel Caricativo is, it's addressed to the whole panel, and it concerns indigenous people's engagement with state and global governance institutions. So he says that the core of sustainable self-determination is our collective rights. And he asks, what sort of strategies can we adopt to guard against the illusion of inclusion, where indigenous groups are only recognized in name, but without substantial participation in governance structures and movement in state discursive positions? So I'd like to ask Ms. Vicky if you'd like to explain your answer.
Yeah. Well, I think my answer is quite clear. I think that that's precisely why we are promoting indigenous people's sustainable self-determined development, precisely because we believe that if indigenous peoples know what their rights are and they are willing to assert and claim these rights, then that's the way to counter, state actions and policies, as well as corporations, that undermine their systems, whether these are their governance systems, their traditional livelihoods or economic systems, as well as their cultures. It's true. Precisely. I said there's a lot of tokenism everywhere, even here in the Philippines, despite the fact that we have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. There is still a long way to go to have this implemented. The reality is that many local governments don't even know that there is an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So even making people, the government officials understand that there's an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act and that this has to be implemented, a lot of work needs to be done. The NCIP, which is mandated to implement the law, has to do much more in terms of educating people about what IPRA means and what are the implications for the states as well as for corporations. So I think that there's no shortcut really. It's really strengthening the indigenous communities themselves, supporting them in their efforts to empower themselves, and then bringing them to dialogue, to engage in advocacy with the governments at various levels and even at the global level. That's also the reason why indigenous people from all over the world came together to push the UN to develop a UN declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, because these are the standards. This is the international standard that defines, and that should be the framework of protecting and fulfilling the basic human rights of indigenous peoples. And most of the articles in the UN Declaration are really talking about collective rights, no? Because all the other human rights conventions, they are more about individual rights, no? But the one that really consolidates a lot of this and interprets it from an indigenous perspective is the UN Declaration, and it's basically about your collective rights to your lands, territories, and your resources, your cultures, and of course your own governance systems, for you to be able to use your own governance systems if you so choose, and your justice systems as well. So that's the way to do it. There's a lot of challenges, but I think that for as long as we persist in the work of making indigenous peoples aware that they do have these rights and that they should assert and continuously claim their rights, and they should relate, they should seek support from the broader community, and of course engage actively in lobbying and advocating with the necessary stakeholders like governments or corporations. If we continue to do that, then maybe somehow there will be changes, no, that will happen. And we would like to, in the monitoring work that we are doing, we really would like to highlight some of the positive examples of, for instance, in the dialogues that we held with the government, where there's a big conflict between the existing laws in the country, like the Department of Agrarian Reform. They go to indigenous communities and convince them to apply for not for ancestral domain title, but for land reform, no, and of course titles to their lands in the DAR framework. So in those cases, we got the indigenous peoples to speak with DAR, and then also DAR together with the NCIP, they have to continuously talk together so that the rights of indigenous peoples will not be undermined by these laws that actually don't recognize the collective rights of indigenous people. So I just like to end there and have others add on.
I think that's thank you po, Ms. Vicky, and I think that's actually our probably our closing remarks for this panel presentation.